All right, so I'll get to more in depth later about my communist ideas, anti-white ideas, and my grandpa's how he kind of broke me out of it later. But like I said, so at this point, I was moving more toward the right wing. But I remember I was at my grandpa's place, and this was during the period when he wasn't teaching me, and my uncle was there. And my uncle, I always thought my uncle and my grandpa were white supremacist Nazis. So my uncle was talking about, he was like, my uncle really liked Trump. My grandpa didn't necessarily like Trump because he thought that Trump. My grandpa said that he thought that Trump was just a fake conservative. He thought that Trump was really secretly liberal, or for welfare, or or I don't know. But my grandpa also, my grandpa's. I'm gonna get into like the ideas of dualistic software that my grandpa would talk about though. So my grandpa's very into like, he's an INFP, so he's very into like talk, being not expressing dualistic software. I'll get to this. But I was with my uncle. My uncle really liked Donald Trump, and my uncle was saying that he didn't. He was saying that there's a cabal, and he's basically saying there's a Jewish cabal. But my grandpa wouldn't say it outright, or my uncle wouldn't say it outright. But he's like, there's a cabal, and he said that they're mainly made up of Jews and Italians, and they hate the white race. And my uncle was telling me that that the cabal is like an octopus, and they have their arms around the world, and they basically control everything, and their main agenda is just to destroy the white race, especially the German race. And my uncle just hated the cabals, and he didn't, and so my uncle would walk around wearing a cross, and he didn't like the Jews. He didn't like, and he said that also Italians are a part of it. He said, the brown people, and my uncle was just very much against them. And I remember I was like, dude, you're a white supremacist, dude. And I wasn't into my uncle. But at the same time, like I said, my grandpa was moving me a little bit more toward thinking right wing. But again, by the way, my grandpa would confuse me. So like, I'll tell you some ways that he confused me. So, but at the same time, it's not so confusing now when I look at it. But my grandpa would be like, I asked my grandpa at one point, I was like, Grandpa, what do you think about gay marriage? And my grandpa was like, it could be a concession to allow gay marriage. And I was like, what do you mean? And my grandpa was like, he said, there can be gay people who have relationships that aren't based upon, because my grandpa said that every relationship is ultimately illusion, because there is no self and there is no other. So for me to be like, I'm in a relationship with you is an illusion. My grandpa would say, never tell anybody I love you, because my grandpa would say, I love you is a lie, because there is no you and there is no other. So how can you say I love you? My grandpa would say, you can only be loving. You can't love another person because there is no other person. And this is my grandpa talk about transpersonal psychology, when you recognize everything is one and there is no self and there is no other, there is no thing. So, but I was, I'm trying to understand my grandpa's teachings. So I asked my grandpa, like, because I always thought he was a white supremacist Nazi, but when I asked him, like, do you think there's such thing as gay people? My grandpa's like, no, there is no such thing as gay people. But of course my grandpa thinks that, because he thinks everything is energy, and you are not your proclivities, you are not your body, everything is one. Now, Dr. Hora, who was my grandpa's teacher, I would later find out, believed that God was infinite love intelligence, but my grandpa didn't think that. My grandpa said that God is energy, and he didn't think that God was in consciousness or intelligence, because my grandpa thought that intelligence was just an epiphenomena of energy patterns, and my grandpa thought, therefore, that consciousness was illusion. My grandpa would say, thoughts don't matter. Transcend your thoughts, because thoughts are based around the ego and are illusion. And now I know what he's saying, because he's saying if you're inspired, you're in the flow, and your thoughts are based around the ego, and like I said, your body, your ego, they occlude the truth. Like now I recognize, because I saw myself as a Jew, I wasn't able to see things the way they are. Everything was filtered through my Jewish lens. But I'll get to that more later, especially in terms of conspiracy theories. Remind me to talk to you about conspiracy theories, even though you can't really remind me, because what I'm saying doesn't make sense. But I will talk later about conspiracy theories and how I didn't like conspiracy theories. I didn't like conspiracy theories because I always thought they were against the Jews, and I saw myself as Jewish. So, like, for instance, I remember one time my grandpa was saying that, we watched that movie Zeitgeist, and my grandpa was like, yeah, the Jews, or the Jews or the cabal might have done the World Trade Center. And I was like, dude, I didn't like that idea, because I'm like, Grandpa, or like my grandpa said, Illuminati. And I didn't like when people talk about the Illuminati, because I always knew there was an anti-Jewish undertone to all of it. So I didn't like conspiracy theories, because I saw myself as Jewish, and I wanted to, save the Jews. But that's why I wanted to race mix the white people, So, because I saw the white people as the biggest threat. But regardless, my grandpa was like, yeah, gay marriage could be a concession. But I was like, why? Why is that? Because I always thought he's a white supremacist. So why would he allow gay marriage, even though he says there's no such thing as gay people? But my grandpa said, well, because again, there's no such thing as relationships because there is no self and other. But my grandpa would say, if there's a gay person and another gay person, I have to use the language to describe it, even though my grandpa says there is no person. They have a relationship. He would say that they can have a relationship founded upon, my grandpa would talk about inquiry and expanding of awareness, which is more transpersonal as opposed to interpersonal relationship. My grandpa would say an interpersonal relationship is a relationship that confirms the self, and he would call it a functional fit, as opposed to love, which my grandpa would say love is not emotional, because emotions confirm the self. My grandpa would say that love is the flow, which is transcendence of the self. So if, I guess, the flow would be, my grandpa would say, mutual participation in something higher than the self. My grandpa would say mutual participation in mutual projects, mutual participation in greater projects. And that would help to transcend the self. So he said that, my grandpa said the reason why he thought that gay marriage could be allowed is because he said there's a lot of straight people who are against gay marriage, but he said a lot of straight people still believe that there is a self and another. Like that there's me and a woman. But my grandpa would say that that's an illusion. And they think that they're superior because they have a heterosexual relationship, but they don't realize that there is no relationships. There is no self and other. And my grandpa said a lot of heterosexual relationships are functional fits, and they're self-confirmatory, and they're based around sex and, self-confirmatory, maybe, like another example would be my grandpa would talk about entertainment. Now, entertainment isn't necessarily bad, but my grandpa would say it stimulates the senses, and the senses, it confirms the illusion of the separate self and all that stuff, right? He would teach me this stuff more later, and I would understand it more later, but at this time I didn't really understand what he was talking about. But, so he would say, there's a lot of heterosexuals who are in relationships that are not the flow, that are not transpersonal, that are not beneficial. Anybody said, and there could be homosexuals who don't have a lot of, because my grandpa would say that sex is self-confirmatory, and sex isn't necessarily bad, because my grandpa would say, yeah, there's a higher aspiration behind sex. It's the desire for oneness, right? And the transcendence of the self. There could be, but my grandpa ultimately would say, sex is self-confirmatory. So my grandpa would obviously say that a relationship based upon sex is self-confirmatory and is not the flow. So my grandpa would say that, there could be some homosexual relationships that are more close to the flow than some heterosexual relationships. So my grandpa said, in order to protect the heterosexuals who think that they're superior by being quote unquote heterosexual, identifying as heterosexual, though my grandpa says there is no such thing as heterosexual either, there is no such thing as a self. So to label yourself as anything is not beneficial. My grandpa would say to allow homosexual marriages could be beneficial. It could be a concession to a work in process, my grandpa would say. Like I said, my grandpa would say a work in progress, but I told my grandpa, hey, grandpa, because I didn't like the idea of progress, because I saw it as white supremacist, because I'm like, progress implies time, and also that things are getting better, and that's the idea, like the white man makes things better, but I didn't like the idea of progress. I wanted to see, I thought that things maybe deteriorated because the white man made things deteriorate. So I was like, instead of using the word progress, use the word process. And my grandpa was like, oh, that's really brilliant. Yeah, I'll use the word process from now on. But he didn't know that, like, underlying my thought processes was an anti-white thing. But so like that's an example. So, but I'm thinking to myself, when he says stuff like this, I'm thinking, okay, he's kind of a liberal. He's kind of a leftist. But at the same time, when you think about it, it's not, though, because if you really delve into what my grandpa's saying, it's actually like even more extreme right wing than a leftist, because he's basically saying, like, relationships are illusions, and sex is confirming an illusion, and it's basically anti-sex. And like the liberals, the leftists, are the ones who are like me. That's what part of the reason why I thought that my grandpa I didn't like my grandpa, because I was very pro, like I said in college, I was pro pornography, pro abortion, pro feminism, like women's sexuality, because I thought that the people who were against it were just white supremacists who wanted to subjugate women and make it so they don't have a lot of sex, so that they can make them into baby makers and not be in pornography, because then if you're in pornography, they're not in the family and making babies. And like, I was anti-family. Like I talked about that. I hated Fox News, because I was like, Fox News are all about the family and loyalty, but I would misuse my grandpa's teaching. So like my grandpa's teaching, he's saying, yeah, the self is an illusion. There is no relationships. And I'd be like, yeah, so the family's an illusion. Because I was like I was looking on Facebook, and there's a lot of like Marxist Jews who were like, the family unit's bad, and they want to destroy the family. And that's the way I was. But I was like, yeah, the family's an illusion. There is no self. There is no other. The Fox News is all about the trying to confirm the illusion of the family and loyalty of the family. And I'm like, no, because deep down I wanted to destroy the family because I wanted to destroy the white race. But I wanted to couch it in my and misuse my grandpa's teachings and be like, yeah, well, no, I really just want to teach people that there is no family and everything is one. And, let's all race mix. That's what I wanted to do. But so I misused my grandpa's teachings. But later my grandpa would teach me. Like I would be like, so, if there is no relationship, so the family's an illusion. Why don't we just disband the family? That's what I wanted. But my grandpa's like, well, a harmonious family is evidence of the flow. And I'm like, okay, so he's confusing me, but so yes, the self is an illusion, but at the same time, like, let's not let our brains pop out of our heads. My grandpa's also recognizes that, yes, like for instance, my grandpa would say the self is an illusion, but sometimes you have to put the self first before you can transcend the self. And like, for instance, yeah, before you can be in the flow and be in the awareness of oneness and function in pure awareness, as my grandpa would say, there's a stage where you work within the family unit and you can have a harmonious family unit. And my grandpa would say, yeah, having a harmonious family unit would be beneficial. But my grandpa would say, ultimately, the flow is the ultimate. And that's when you transcend the illusion that you are in a separate family. But it doesn't mean that you just like me when I was a Marxist, I was like, okay, let's just destroy the family then. And because everybody's one, let's all just race mix. But my grandpa wasn't saying that because I didn't realize that was still dualistic software. And that was my ego because I saw myself as Jewish. So that was still my ego. So I'm like, yeah, Fox News is just the ego. They just want the family because they're just white supremacists. They're just based around the ego. But I was also based around the ego. But the satanic ego of destroy the white race, which is what Satan wanted to do in Hinduism, which I later discovered. But, Satan is Shukracharya in the Hindu mythology. So, but anyway, so I'm just trying to kind of decipher, show you guys kind of what my grandpa was teaching and why it confused me. So I'm like, okay, so you're a leftist, kind of, but not really. You're still pretty much right wing, but because I discovered that's what Dr. Hora taught too. Dr. Hora was saying like, yeah, the self is an illusion and sex is self-confirmatory. So I was, when I would later read Dr. Hora, I was like, okay, so yeah, he's a right winger. He's against sex. I always thought right wing is against sex. But my grandpa would say he's not against sex because being against it, that would also be self-confirmatory. But my grandpa would say if you're in the flow, you're not focused on sex, But at the same time, if you're like against sex and you're prude, that would also be self-confirmatory. That's why my grandpa says that there is no formula for the flow. Okay? But as you can see, my grandpa's confusing me. So I'm trying to understand my grandpa's teachings. And then, like I said, I'm hanging around my uncle. My uncle is just a white supremacist. And he's like, yeah, the cabal is a bunch of Jews and Italians, and they hate the white race. And so, and I remember I got in an argument with my uncle. I was like, dude, you're just a white supremacist Nazi, dude. And my uncle got in a fight with me. And then my grandpa kicked me out of the apartment. And I was like, Grandpa, you're on my uncle's side? You are a white supremacist, But my grandpa's not a white supremacist. It's more complex. But, I always saw him as a white supremacist right-winger. So at this point, I'm just confused. But my grandpa, as I was saying, he was kind of moving me more toward the right wing because I'm starting to understand his teachings a little bit more. So my grandpa at this point, he was teaching me a little bit about, he was actually teaching me what the different levels of dualistic software were. But I still didn't completely understand it. But like he would teach me, so he started to say, okay, well, I have to first say that he like I said, he wasn't teaching me for a long time. Because he stopped teaching me because we got in an argument because he was saying, I wanted to talk to my mom and dad. And I was trying to talk to my mom and dad. My mom wouldn't talk to me. My dad wouldn't talk to me. They wouldn't see me. They hadn't seen me for 15 years. So I wanted to talk to them, but then they wouldn't. And then finally I started playing basketball at Compton College. And my grandpa liked that. My grandpa's like, oh, you're part of the synergy again. You're working. You're doing something. But I was always doing something. I was doing the quadrant model. But he didn't know that the quadrant model was a theory of everything. He thought that was just made up. So he saw that I was playing at Compton College, and my grandpa's like, okay, I'll start teaching you again. So he started teaching me again. So then my grandpa's teaching me about the different levels of software. So like he started to delineate them for me. So he was like, okay, there's the impersonal levels, which is like predator prey. And these are action oriented, where impersonal action oriented, like predator prey is where you will actually kill somebody, or like ally enemy. If they do something for you, then you kill them. If they don't, then you, if they do something for you, then you're nice to them. If they don't, then you kill them. They're your enemy. These are like impersonal levels. And I don't remember the exact levels that he delineated, but like then there was like superior, inferior. This is more attitudinal, where you would say you don't necessarily perform any action against someone, but it's attitudinal, like you just feel superior to somebody. An example like my grandpa would give with like someone on Facebook. Someone on Facebook says like, I don't know, like, the Christianity is the only way. My grandpa would say, well, that could come from different levels of software. My grandpa could say it could come from the flow, in recognizing that Christ taught the flow and there is only one flow. So my grandpa could say it could come from that, but he said it also could come from like superior, inferior software, where someone is just attitudinal, where the person just gets a sense of being superior by being Christian. And my grandpa would say that is self-confirmatory, but it's not necessarily bad. It's just dualistic software. And it's confirming the illusion of the self. But then my grandpa would say that there's predator-prey software. Someone could even say that from predator-prey software. It'd say Christianity is the only way. And so, but it's action-oriented, impersonal. My grandpa would say superior, inferior software is just interpersonal, attitudinal-oriented, where you don't perform an action. But predator-prey is action-oriented, impersonal, where you say Christianity is the only way. And so anybody who doesn't believe it, I'm going to kill them. Then my grandpa would say that would be predator-prey software. And then my grandpa would say that also there's insider-outsider software, which my grandpa would say is either attitudinal or action-oriented. So it could be impersonal or interpersonal. And in insider-outsider, it's more like, he said sometimes it could be impersonal, because you would say like, okay, yeah, only Jews are allowed here. And so then if someone's not a Jew, then you kick them out. And that's insider-outsider. Now, again, my grandpa would say, though, that could be a part of the flow too. Because you could have systems that you do and like rituals and stuff, and you do them, and you exclude people who are not a part of it because you don't compromise. And the rituals, my grandpa would say, you don't perform the rituals to please a separate God, because my grandpa says that there is no separate God. Everything is just one energy event, according to my grandpa. So you just do the rituals to take you out of your habits and your circumstances and stuff, and it helps you to get into the flow and takes you out of yourself. And this is an interesting one that my grandpa said, and again, one that made me kind of like think that he was a white supremacist was, I remember at one point, I don't remember exactly when, but I asked him, what do you think about the concentration camps and what happened to the Jews? And my grandpa was like, by forcing the Jews to work, it actually might have helped a lot of the Jews. Because my grandpa thought that a lot of the Jews were in dualistic software, and by the Germans forcing them to work, my grandpa thinks that if you do work, that can break you out of yourself and help you to transcend dualistic software to the flow. But again, I didn't understand what he's talking about at this point. I was still kind of, because still at this point when my grandpa talked about the flow, I wasn't certain what he was talking about. And it's only when I started studying from Dr. Hora's books, I started to understand what he's talking about, that the flow is like transcendence of the ego. And, like now I understand, but back then I didn't understand like that my ego was more Jewish oriented, that I saw myself as Jewish. And so when I wanted to think about the flow, I wanted to think, oh, race mixing is the flow. But that was also my ego. But if you're really in the flow, you can see things as they truly are and not shaped by your ego, not filtered by your ego. So your ego, your senses, my grandpa would say, your senses don't tell you the way things really are. So when you're in the flow, you actually transcend the senses. You see, so my grandpa said like Einstein, when he had the inspiration of E equals MC squared, he transcended the senses, because your senses don't tell you that. It was an inspiration. He was in the flow, my grandpa would say. And like I said, my grandpa says there's no formula for the flow. You can't make that happen. My grandpa said that when Einstein had that realization, he said that, when you exhaust all resources, perhaps when you're eating an apple, the answer might tap you on the shoulder. It's when you least expect it, because it's not the self that creates the flow, which is the realization, which is the inspiration. So, but like I said, I started understanding this stuff later. So my grandpa's starting to try. So I'm starting my move. At this point, I was like 2019. I'm moving more toward the right wing, and I remember at that time I was like, my whole life I was like I thought that I thought that my grandpa was a white supremacist against welfare. But for the first time, at this point in my life, I was moving more toward being like against welfare. And I was like, okay, I was trying to understand my grandpa's teachings, and I was like, okay, you know, I was against like I didn't like Bernie Sanders and those types of people and stuff. But my grandpa would say though too, like my grandpa says there's no formula. My grandpa would say if people are in the flow, then you know what welfare could work sometimes. And if you're in the flow, you can discern. But for the most part. So, but anyways, at this point, I started moving more to becoming a right winger, and I was becoming more of a white supremacist again. This is like 2019. Although, like I said, a Jew always is going to want to race mix the white people, probably if he's identifying as a Jew, because they, But I was moving more toward right wing, and I was moving more toward being pro-white. And I was starting to understand my grandpa's teachings more, but at the same time, I still wasn't. But I'll get to when I started to more understand my grandpa's teachings. But like I said, I would move back to being a left winger, and I'll get to that. And I'll get to more how I started to really decipher my grandpa's teachings, the metapsychiatry, and I really started getting understanding of it in the next lectures.